The night was supposed to be safe, warm, predictable. A Hollywood Christmas gathering where power loosened its tie and laughter replaced reputation for just a few hours. Inside a polished mansion filled with familiar faces, the air carried the scent of pine, expensive scotch, and the quiet confidence of people who believed nothing truly bad could happen to them. This was not a place where disasters were meant to begin. Yet this was the night everything cracked. What unfolded did not happen behind closed doors or in whispered phone calls. It happened in full view, under soft lights and polite smiles, at a holiday party hosted by Conan O'Brien, a man known for humor, irony, and control over chaos. That control slipped without warning. Guests would later say they felt it before they understood it. A shift in temperature, a tightening in the chest, the instinctive sense that something was deeply wrong. When Rob Reiner entered the room, he looked like the man everyone thought they knew. The familiar smile was there, the one tied forever to films about love, loyalty, and human connection. But up close, the smile did not reach his eyes. His shoulders were tense, his movements careful, as if he were bracing against an invisible force. He was not arriving to celebrate. He was arriving to contain something already slipping beyond his control. Walking beside him was his wife, quiet and alert, scanning the room, not with curiosity, but with concern. And then there was their son. Nick Reiner did not move like a guest. He cut through the space with purpose, his presence sharp enough to silence conversations. His head was shaved. His eyes did not wander in wonder or recognition. They measured. They assessed. People noticed it instantly, even if they did not yet understand what they were seeing. The room responded the way crowds always do when danger enters politely. Smiles froze. Laughter softened. Conversations died mid-sentence. No one announced that something was wrong, but everyone felt it. This was not drunkenness or social awkwardness. This was friction, something cold pressing against warmth, daring it to react. Nick did not ease himself into the gathering. He challenged it. His interactions were abrupt, unsettling, stripped of courtesy. Questions landed like blades, not to connect, but to dominate. Each exchange felt deliberate, as though he were testing boundaries in a room built entirely on them. Guests later recalled how quickly the mood shifted from festive to fragile, how eyes kept drifting back toward Rob, watching for his reaction, waiting for him to step in and fix what fathers are supposed to fix. But Rob hesitated. He still believed in time, in privacy, in the idea that love, reinforced by silence, could smooth over cracks that were already too deep. He had spent a lifetime trusting that stories resolve themselves if you give them enough space. That belief was unraveling in front of everyone he respected. The confrontation, when it came, was not subtle. Voices rose. The room seemed to shrink. Decades of professional composure collapsed into raw fear and desperation. Guests who had known Rob for generations stood frozen, watching not a director or a power figure, but a father realizing that the person in front of him no longer recognized the rules that held the world together. His wife's calm gave way to visible alarm. This was no argument destined to fade by morning. This was something irreversible taking shape in real time. What made the moment unbearable was not the volume, but the clarity. This was not confusion. It was intent. The energy in Nick's movements did not spike and crash. It stayed steady, controlled, and disturbingly focused. Those who witnessed it would later struggle to describe why it frightened them so deeply. It was not rage. It was absence, an emotional distance that felt colder than anger ever could. At some point, the shouting slowed. The damage did not. Rob leaned toward a friend and spoke words no one expected from a man who had commanded film sets and careers for decades. He said he was scared, not embarrassed, not angry, scared. The sentence landed like a weight on the room. This was the moment the illusion finally broke. When the family left, the party did not resume. Music felt inappropriate. Laughter felt dishonest. Outside, the cold air burned the lungs as the car disappeared into the night, carrying with it a dread that none of the guests could name, but all of them felt. The city continued glowing as it always does, pretending perfection was intact. Inside that car, something had already ended. No one there knew exactly what would come next, but many would later realize they had witnessed a warning, loud and impossible to ignore. A moment when silence was chosen over intervention, hope over boundaries, love over action. The night closed gently, as nights often do. The reckoning was already on its way. Long before that Christmas night, before raised voices and frozen smiles, the Reiner household had already been living with a quiet tension that outsiders rarely saw. From the outside, the family represented stability and success, the kind of Hollywood lineage that seemed protected by talent, money, and goodwill. Rob Reiner had built a career on stories that celebrated empathy and human connection. His films suggested that love, when honest and persistent, could overcome almost anything. That belief did not stay on screen. It shaped the way he lived, the way he parented, and the way he responded when something began to fracture inside his own home. Rob was not a distant or authoritarian father. Friends often described him as patient, soft-spoken, and deeply invested in the emotional lives of his children. He believed in conversation, in giving space, in letting people find their way rather than forcing them down a path. In his world, pressure only created resistance, and resistance led to resentment. He had seen enough of Hollywood's damage to know that control could break a person faster than neglect. So when problems emerged, his instinct was not to confront aggressively, but to absorb, to protect, to hope. Those instincts were reinforced by years of professional success. Rob had spent decades navigating egos, crises, and creative conflicts. He had watched actors unravel under pressure and then recover when given patience instead of punishment. He trusted that turmoil was temporary, that people could circle back to themselves if surrounded by enough care. This worldview worked on film sets. It worked in boardrooms. Inside a family, it proved far more dangerous. Nick Reiner grew up inside that environment of privilege and emotional openness, but also inside a shadow. Being the child of a celebrated figure meant every struggle was quietly magnified. Expectations were never spoken, yet they hovered everywhere. Success was normalized. Failure felt isolating. From an early age, Nick moved between worlds, one where doors opened easily, and another where identity felt constantly questioned. Those who knew him as a young man described someone intelligent, observant, and restless, a person who absorbed energy from his surroundings but rarely released it in healthy ways. Over time, cracks appeared. Periods of instability were followed by attempts at recovery. Each cycle reinforced Rob's belief that intervention should be gentle, that harsh boundaries might do more harm than good. Treatment was pursued. Support systems were arranged. Privacy was guarded fiercely. The family closed ranks, not out of denial, but out of love. They believed that shielding Nick from public scrutiny was an act of protection, a way to give him room to heal without the weight of judgment. But healing never followed a straight line. Friends began to notice patterns that did not resolve, mood shifts that lingered, a growing detachment that felt less like pain and more like distance. Nick's presence could dominate a room without effort, not through volume, but through tension. Conversations bent around him. People adjusted their tone, their words, their posture. Rob noticed this too, but interpreted it through the lens he trusted most. He believed closeness would ground his son, that staying near, staying involved, staying hopeful would prevent a complete collapse. Michelle, steady and observant, often carried the unspoken weight of that approach. She managed the emotional logistics of daily life, smoothing transitions, calming moments, holding space when others retreated. She understood the cost of silence, but also feared the consequences of escalation. Together, she and Rob made countless small decisions guided by one central hope. That love, reinforced consistently and quietly, would be enough. The problem was not that warning signs were absent. It was that they were familiar. Each sign looked like a version of something the family had already survived. Each incident felt containable because it resembled earlier storms that had eventually passed. Over time, familiarity dulled urgency. What might have alarmed outsiders became normalized inside the walls of the home. Concern turned into routine management. Fear learned how to wait. This gradual shift was invisible to the public. To the world, Rob remained the same figure, generous, thoughtful, and composed. Interviews never hinted at chaos. Appearances were polished. Advocacy and mentorship continued. The machine of success kept moving, and so did the family, adapting quietly, telling themselves that stability was being maintained. Nick, meanwhile, grew increasingly disconnected from the narrative others held about him. He no longer seemed interested in fitting into expectations, familial or social. His behavior oscillated between withdrawal and confrontation, as if he were testing how far he could push without being stopped. Each test that went unanswered reinforced a dangerous lesson. That limits were flexible. That authority could be challenged without consequence. That attention, even negative attention, confirmed control. Rob sensed the shift, but his response remained rooted in the same philosophy. He believed confrontation would fracture what little trust remained. He believed that holding on was better than pushing away. He believed that love meant endurance. These beliefs were not naive. They were forged by decades of experience and compassion. But compassion without boundaries slowly eroded the structure meant to contain it. By the time that Christmas gathering arrived, the tension had been building for years. The night did not create the crisis. It exposed it. What guests witnessed was not a sudden rupture, but the surface expression of a long, buried struggle. A family that had been balancing hope against fear, silence against action, loyalty against safety. Looking back, it becomes clear that the tragedy did not begin with violence. It began with restraint, with decisions made to preserve peace rather than confront risk, with the belief that patience could substitute for intervention. The past was not empty of chances. It was crowded with them, layered one on top of another, each moment offering a choice between comfort and confrontation. Those choices were made by people who loved deeply and feared equally deeply. That is what makes this story so unsettling. There was no villain in the early chapters, only a family trying to protect one of its own, unaware that protection without limits can slowly become permission. By the time the sun rose over Brentwood the morning after that Christmas party, whatever had been quietly destabilizing the Reiner household had reached a point of no return. The night before had not resolved anything. It had stripped away illusions. Fear had replaced hope, and the fragile balance the family had been maintaining collapsed under its own weight. What followed did not arrive with sirens or chaos. It arrived with silence, the kind that feels heavier than noise. Inside the house, time seemed suspended. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no alarms screaming for attention. Everything appeared intact, almost curated, as if the walls themselves were trying to preserve the image of order that had defined the family for decades. That absence of disruption would later become one of the most chilling elements of the case. Nothing had been broken to get inside, because nothing needed to be. The first interruption came not from authorities, but from routine. A scheduled visit, an ordinary appointment meant to continue a life that had already ended. When the gate went unanswered and calls disappeared into voicemail, concern replaced patience. Something fell off. Not dramatic, not panicked, just wrong. The kind of wrong that presses inward, tightening the chest without explanation. When help arrived, reality arrived with it. The house that once represented warmth, creativity, and safety revealed a truth no one wanted to face. The details would later be carefully measured and cataloged, but in that moment, facts gave way to shock. The loss was total. Rob Reiner, a man whose life had been defined by storytelling and compassion, was gone. His wife, the quiet anchor of the family, was gone as well. The absence left behind was immediate and irreversible. Investigators moved methodically, but the scene refused to behave like a typical crime. There were no signs of intrusion, no evidence of a struggle consistent with a robbery. Valuables remained untouched. Drawers were closed. The house did not look like it had been invaded. It looked like it had been betrayed. That realization shifted the entire trajectory of the investigation in an instant. Attention turned inward, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. The last known conflict was not speculative. It had unfolded publicly, hours earlier, witnessed by people who had no reason to exaggerate. The argument at the party was no longer an uncomfortable memory. It was a timeline marker, a warning that had arrived too late. As the city woke up unaware, another narrative was unfolding miles away. Surveillance cameras captured something investigators did not expect to see. Nick Reiner was not running. He was not hiding. He moved through public spaces with an unsettling calm, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of a city that had no idea who was passing through it. At a gas station, under harsh fluorescent lights, he waited in line like anyone else. He chose a drink. He paid. He left. The ordinariness of the footage was more disturbing than panic ever could have been. There was no visible fear, no confusión, no sign of emotional collapse. Experts would later point out that genuine psychological breaks rarely look like this. They tend to leave chaos in their wake. Mistakes, disorganization. Instead, what the camera showed was control, deliberate movement, awareness of surroundings, an ability to function socially, politely, even casually, while carrying the weight of something unspeakable. From there, the pattern continued. Public transportation, a temporary place to stay. Windows covered not out of paranoia, but out of precaution. Actions that suggested not delusion, but foresight. Each step added another layer of complexity to the question that would soon dominate courtrooms and headlines alike. Was this the behavior of someone detached from reality, or someone managing consequences? When he was finally taken into custody, there was no confrontation, no resistance, no emotional outburst. He surrendered quietly, as if the outcome had already been accepted. Authorities placed him under close medical observation, isolating him from the general population. Officially, it was for safety. High-profile cases attract risk. Unofficially, it acknowledged the gravity of the psychological questions at play. As forensic teams continued their work, the physical evidence began to speak. Injuries were cataloged with clinical precision, but the implications behind them were anything but neutral. The level of force described suggested not randomness, but intensity. Not confusion, but emotion. Experts recognized the pattern immediately. Overkill, a term that carries weight because it points to motive without ever naming it directly. It implies familiarity, personal connection, a release of something that had been building for a long time. Science added its own voice. Blood patterns, transfer evidence, microscopic traces that do not lie. In violent encounters, the body leaves behind a record even when the mind tries to erase it. Skin cells, DNA, the unintentional marks of proximity and struggle. These details form what forensic specialists call a biochemical handshake. Proof of presence at the exact moment something irreversible occurs. Unlike narratives, these details cannot be reframed. They simply exist. The absence of forced entry, combined with the nature of the injuries, narrowed the field until only one possibility remained. The threat had not come from outside the gates. It had been inside all along. The same love that had once protected had also provided access. The same trust that kept the family intact had eliminated barriers. As news spread, disbelief followed quickly by grief rippled through the public. Fans struggled to reconcile the man they admired with the reality of his final moments. Colleagues remembered generosity, mentorship, warmth. None of it aligned with the brutality now attached to his name. Yet the facts refused to soften. This was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of a long, silent struggle that had finally erupted. What made this phase of the story unbearable was not just the loss, but the recognition. The signs had been there. The fear had been voiced. The night before, Rob had admitted he did not know what would happen next. That uncertainty now felt prophetic. The tragedy did not arrive without warning. It arrived after warnings were acknowledged, felt, and left unresolved. As the investigation moved forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a case about wealth or fame or privilege gone wrong. It was about the fragile line between care and denial. About how easily love can delay action until action is no longer possible. The events of that morning did not erase the past. They reframed it, casting every earlier choice in a harsher, clearer light. The impact did not stop at the crime scene or with the arrest. It rippled outward, slow and relentless, touching every layer of the world Rob Reiner had spent a lifetime building. In the days that followed, the house in Brentwood transformed from a private sanctuary into a symbol of devastation. Yellow tape replaced hedges. Cameras replaced neighbors. Silence replaced everything else. What once felt untouchable now looked painfully exposed. For those closest to Rob Reiner, the loss was not abstract. It was physical, disorienting, and constant. Friends who had shared decades of laughter with him described waking up each morning expecting to see his name light up their phones, only to remember again that the world had shifted. Colleagues struggled to speak his name without pausing. The absence felt wrong, as if a familiar structure had been removed from reality itself. He had been more than a filmmaker. He had been a connector, someone who believed deeply in people and invested in them without hesitation. Michelle's absence carried a different kind of weight. She had never sought the spotlight, yet her presence had been the stabilizing force behind everything. Those who knew the family understood that much of what worked had worked because of her. She absorbed pressure quietly, managed emotional storms without recognition, and held the family together when cracks appeared. Her loss left behind a vacuum that words could not fill. Grief for her was quieter, but no less devastating. Public reaction moved quickly from shock to disbelief, then to uncomfortable reflection. Fans revisited Rob's films and found themselves watching them through a new lens. Scenes about love, forgiveness, and family connection felt heavier, almost prophetic. What once seemed hopeful now carried an edge of sorrow. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man who spent his life teaching audiences how to care for one another had been destroyed by the very bond he cherished most. Within the legal system, the case took on a gravity that went far beyond celebrity. Prosecutors and defense teams prepared for a battle that would not just determine guilt, but meaning. The question was no longer simply what happened, but how it should be understood. The behavior after the crime, the calm movements, the calculated decisions, all clashed violently with claims of total psychological collapse. Each side framed the same facts differently, knowing that perception would shape outcome. For Nick Reiner, the consequences were immediate and isolating. He was removed from public view, placed under constant observation, and stripped of autonomy. The controlled environment reflected the seriousness of the case, but it also underscored the contradiction at its core. The same system now tasked with protecting him from harm was the one preparing to judge whether he had understood his actions at all. Isolation became both precaution and symbol, a visual representation of how far the family bond had collapsed. Beyond the courtroom, the story forced difficult conversations into the open. Mental health advocates, legal experts, and families watching from afar began asking questions they had long avoided. How many warning signs are enough before silence becomes dangerous? Where does compassion end and responsibility begin? When does protecting someone cross into enabling them? These are not theoretical debates anymore. They were grounded in loss, in names, in a family that could no longer speak for itself. The entertainment industry felt the impact in quieter ways. Projects were paused, tributes were planned, and then reconsidered. No one wanted to exploit the tragedy, yet no one could ignore it either. Rob's absence left creative gaps that could not be filled by replacement. Younger filmmakers who had relied on his mentorship spoke openly about how he had shaped their careers, how he had believed in them when others did not. His death was not just the end of life, but the interruption of countless others he had been guiding forward. The broader public response evolved from mourning into unease. This was not a story that allowed clean emotional release. There was no clear villain to condemn without hesitation, no comfortable moral conclusion to retreat into. The facts resisted simplification. Love had been present. Effort had been made. Resources had been available. And yet, the outcome was catastrophic. That realization unsettled people because it challenged the comforting belief that care and privilege guarantee safety. Inside families watching from a distance, the story landed differently. Parents recognized the instinct to protect at all costs. Siblings recognized the pressure to stay loyal, even when something feels wrong. The tragedy mirrored private fears many had never voiced. It suggested that ignoring discomfort does not make it disappear, that waiting for certainty can be as dangerous as acting without it. The consequences of inaction suddenly felt real. As days turned into weeks, grief did not fade. It settled. The house remained sealed off, but the questions did not. Each new detail added weight rather than clarity. The absence of forced entry continued to echo through every discussion. Trust had been the open door. Love had been the access point. That truth lingered longer than any headline. What made the aftermath so heavy was not only what had been lost, but what could no longer be fixed. There would be no conversation to resolve misunderstandings, no opportunity to draw firmer boundaries, no chance to revisit decisions made with good intentions but devastating consequences. Everything that remained was reactive, shaped by systems and procedures rather than choice. The legacy left behind became complicated overnight. Rob Reiner would always be remembered for what he gave the world, but that memory now carried an added layer of sorrow. His life's work stood in stark contrast to his life's end, forcing people to sit with discomfort rather than resolution. That discomfort became part of the story, inseparable from the grief. Nothing about the aftermath felt complete. The pain did not resolve into lessons neatly learned. It lingered as a warning, as a reminder that love without limits can fracture instead of heal, and that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can carry consequences far heavier than anyone expects. The quiet moments often reveal more than the chaos ever could. In the days following the tragedy, small details emerged that gave insight into the hidden struggles of the Reiner household, moments unnoticed by the public, but seared into the memories of those who were present. People spoke hesitantly at first, careful not to sensationalize, yet determined that the truth, in its raw and fractured form, be acknowledged. Friends described the family's life as a careful balancing act, one maintained through rituals, routines, and the careful management of appearances. Every day carried the weight of unspoken anxieties, conversations left incomplete, and gestures of care that hid as much as they revealed. Inside the mansion, the family's routines had always seemed ordinary to outsiders. Breakfast shared quietly, evenings spent in small, familiar patterns. Yet those routines were more than mere habit. They were mechanisms for stability, fragile structures designed to contain escalating tensions. Nick's behavior, once intermittent, had begun to challenge those structures. Moments that seemed insignificant to an outsider, an unusually sharp question, a refusal to engage in conversation, a door closed with more force than necessary, were actually indicators of a mind increasingly distant from the family narrative. These small, accumulating actions created a sense of unease that only those closest could interpret. Friends recalled the way Rob and Michelle navigated the early warning signs. They were gentle, thoughtful, and deliberately measured. They did not react with harsh discipline, but with persistence, using patience as both shield and strategy. Every intervention was calculated to preserve dignity while attempting to redirect behavior. Yet, paradoxically, each act of careful attention reinforced the lesson that boundaries could be flexible, that intervention could be delayed without immediate consequence. Love, in its purest form, had begun to erode the lines that might have contained danger. The social gatherings, those moments designed to inject normalcy, took on new significance in retrospect. Guests described subtleties of the holiday party that went unnoticed in real time. A pause too long between interactions, a glance held too long, a casual question met with a sharp, controlled response. Each was a sign, a microcosm of the larger dynamic that had been building over years. The tension was not always visible as confrontation, but it was always present as a weight. People could feel in the room, even when they could not explain it. The instinctive recognition of danger, subtle yet undeniable, hung in the air like static. There were personal moments, too, that would later emerge through recollections. Nick's retreat into isolation at times, the way he would move silently through rooms, observing without engaging, created an almost ghostly presence. He had lived within the family's orbit, yet seemed increasingly detached, a spectator rather than participant. Those who had seen him in these quiet moments described an intensity that was simultaneously ordinary and alarming. Ordinary because it fit within normal adolescent moods, alarming because it hinted at a focus and control beyond his years. This juxtaposition made him unpredictable, leaving those around him uncertain about how to respond. Rob's response to these patterns was consistent with his philosophy of life. He sought to understand, to guide, and to maintain trust. He remained committed to the belief that the family unit, reinforced by patience and emotional engagement, could absorb and redirect distressing behaviors. Every moment of confrontation he avoided, every argument he muted, was an attempt to preserve the possibility of resolution. Yet, each avoidance also allowed underlying issues to intensify, creating pressure points that would later erupt. Michelle's quiet stewardship of the household provided a counterbalance, but even her resilience had limits. She managed schedules, relationships, and emotional turbulence with care, often anticipating issues before they surfaced. Yet the intensity of her attentiveness was not always visible. Outsiders would see a composed figure, perhaps serene, perhaps simply polite. What they did not see was the accumulation of tension, the constant assessment of mood, the anticipation of triggers. Every meal, every conversation, every plan was filtered through an awareness of potential volatility. The night of the party crystallized these years of silent preparation and subtle warning signs. Nick's deliberate testing of boundaries in front of guests was not accidental. It was a culmination of behavioral patterns that had been forming for years. Each interaction, each cold or detached question, was a measure of control, an assertion of independence in a way that was simultaneously adolescent and calculated. Those who observed it at the time described a sense of foreboding that lingered, the unshakable sense that something beyond ordinary conflict was unfolding. After the event, reflection cast the earlier years in a different light. The family's private moments, the careful interventions, the patience, the love, all appeared as part of a long, precarious rope stretched over an abyss. Each choice, each act of restraint, each attempt to maintain normalcy was a thread in that rope. Yet threads frayed, and the weight of accumulated pressure began to assert itself. Observers began to recognize patterns of behavior that had seemed isolated, minor, or manageable, now appearing as precursors, warnings that had been missed or minimized. Psychologists and forensic experts examining the situation later emphasized the cumulative impact of long-term behavioral patterns combined with environmental pressure. The indicators were not sudden, but a slow accretion of small, observable actions, each of which contributed to an eventual breaking point. The family's protective measures, designed to contain instability, paradoxically facilitated a sense of agency and empowerment in behaviors that would later prove catastrophic. Silence, patience, and love, qualities meant to nurture, had inadvertently set the stage for tragedy. Friends, colleagues, and extended family spoke of the subtle shifts that went unnoticed by most. How Nick's gaze could freeze a conversation, how his physical presence could alter the mood of a room, how minor deviations from normal behavior were met with caution rather than confrontation. Each small detail, seemingly mundane, added to a mosaic of tension. The combination of control, detachment, and deliberate action created a psychological landscape that only those intimately involved could navigate. To an outsider, it appeared calm, ordinary, yet beneath the surface, turbulence had been building unchecked. This part of the story illuminates the profound difficulty of recognizing danger when it is intertwined with love. The family's interventions were informed by care, their patience born of commitment, their silence chosen to avoid escalation. Yet in doing so, they unintentionally allowed pressure to accumulate, stress to intensify, and agency to become empowerment in the wrong hands. What unfolded at the party, and ultimately the tragedy that followed, was the visible outcome of a series of choices made over years, each intended to protect, guide, and preserve, yet converging toward an outcome that no one anticipated. The quieter stories, the overlooked moments, the subtle tensions, all serve as a reminder of the complexity of human behavior. Love does not guarantee safety. Patience does not guarantee resolution. Silence can shelter both healing and harm. These nuances, invisible in the immediate aftermath, define the depth of the tragedy. They reveal that behind public appearances and carefully maintained routines, there was a constant negotiation with uncertainty, a delicate balancing act that ultimately proved insufficient. In the aftermath, reflection cast the entire story in a sharper, more painful light. What had seemed like isolated incidents were actually part of a continuum, a tapestry of tension, restraint, and misjudged trust. The legacy of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner was no longer just the work they left on screens, the laughter, or the mentorship of a generation of filmmakers. It was also the stark lesson in the human cost of loving without limits, in the fragility of hope when confronted with forces beyond control. Their lives have been a series of choices guided by devotion, patience, and belief in redemption. Rob had invested decades in teaching audiences the value of empathy, of seeing the humanity in others, of standing steadfast in relationships even when tested. He lived those lessons at home, too, trying to guide a son whose path had already begun diverging in ways subtle, yet increasingly pronounced. Michelle's quiet endurance provided the foundation that made Rob's philosophy practicable. She bore the emotional labor, the constant vigilance, and the weight of anticipating danger that no one outside the walls could perceive. Their partnership, in many ways, was a study in resilience, an unspoken covenant to protect, to nurture, to guide. Yet the tragedy revealed an uncomfortable paradox. Love, in its purest form, can also blind. The very qualities that made the family strong, compassion, patience, trust, became vulnerabilities. They delayed confrontation, softened responses, and allowed space for behaviors that ultimately proved destructive. Their devotion, meant to shield, could not contain the escalating consequences of mismanaged distress. In this, the story transcends the particulars of the Reiner household and reflects a universal truth. Human connection, no matter how well-intentioned, is always entwined with risk. Experts examining the case emphasize the accumulation of stressors that had gone unmitigated. Years of subtle warning signs, intermittent interventions, and protective silences created a psychological landscape in which a dangerous sense of autonomy could flourish. Each small choice, to withhold judgment, to avoid escalation, to prioritize love over enforcement of boundaries, contributed to a framework in which the tragedy became increasingly probable. The lesson is not that the family failed morally, but that their strategy, though rooted in care, underestimated the interplay between emotional neglect, behavioral patterns, and personal agency. The wider implications of the story began to emerge as friends, colleagues, and the public grappled with its meaning. Mental health professionals highlighted the importance of timely intervention, of recognizing signs before they culminate in irreparable consequences. Families watched, asking themselves difficult questions. How often had they dismissed subtle cues in their own lives? How had love, patience, or loyalty unintentionally shielded danger instead of preventing it? The tragedy of the Reiners became a cautionary narrative, a reminder that good intentions are not sufficient without action and accountability. Within the community of Hollywood insiders, the event sparked conversations that extended beyond the family. The narrative challenged assumptions about celebrity households, about wealth, and about the protective veneer often assumed to shield families from private crises. Colleagues recalled Rob's mentorship, his generosity, and the human warmth that defined him professionally. In juxtaposition, the personal collapse revealed a stark vulnerability. Even those who seemed invulnerable in public life were subject to the same uncertainties, risks, and heartbreaks as any other family. The gap between public persona and private reality became a lens through which many reconsidered their understanding of human resilience. Rob and Michelle's story also highlighted the limits of legacy. For decades, Rob had cultivated a public identity centered on connection, humor, and compassion. He had embodied the principles he celebrated in film and in life. Yet in the final act, those achievements could not protect what was closest to him. The narrative underscores the distinction between professional influence and private impact, reminding observers that mastery in one domain does not translate into immunity in another. Legacy, in this sense, is complex. It is simultaneously inspiring and sobering, illustrative of achievement, but also reflective of vulnerability. Even as the legal and forensic details became central to public discourse, the emotional resonance persisted. Those who had witnessed or followed the story described a lingering sense of unresolved tension, the sensation that grief, responsibility, and unanswered questions were inseparable. The examination of evidence, the procedural assessments, the debates over intent or mental state, all carried weight, but they could not substitute for understanding the depth of relational dynamics and emotional history that shaped the outcome. Here, narrative and fact intersected. The human story could not be reduced to evidence alone, and the evidence could not fully explain the human story. In these reflections, the Reiner's experience offers a larger meditation on the interplay between care and risk, love and danger, silence and consequence. It challenges the assumption that devotion guarantees safety, reminding us that emotional investment, without structure or boundaries, can be both protective and hazardous. It underscores the necessity of vigilance, not in spite of love, but as a component of it. Awareness, timely action, and discernment are not contradictions to compassion. They are expressions of it. Ultimately, the legacy of Rob and Michelle encompasses both inspiration and warning. Their lives illuminate the capacity for empathy, endurance, and creativity. Yet they also illustrate the limits of these qualities when confronted by complex behavioral realities. They leave behind not only films and memories, but a profound testament to the human condition. That even the most devoted, compassionate individuals are subject to forces beyond control, and that love, however deep, requires boundaries and insight to prevent harm. The final echoes of the tragedy did not fade with time. They only transformed. The Reiner estate remained cordoned off, the meticulously trimmed hedges and flawless lawns now framing a narrative of loss rather than accomplishment. What had been a home radiating warmth and creativity had become a locus of silence, a space haunted by absence. Every corner, every room, carried the weight of what had been irreversibly altered. Visitors and neighbors sensed the shift, even without understanding the specifics. The air was charged with a kind of reverence, the hushed acknowledgement that something sacred had been violated. Outside the walls, public attention continued to swirl, but it was tempered by respect and disbelief. The media dissected details, yet they could not capture the full measure of grief that had settled into the lives of those closest to the family. Friends and colleagues described days and nights marked by reflection, by an almost physical heaviness that no conversation could fully lighten. Even among those accustomed to the intensity of Hollywood life, the Reiner tragedy transcended ordinary experiences of loss. It was intimate, devastating, and inescapable. For those who had known Rob Reiner professionally, the juxtaposition of his public persona and private reality became painfully evident. He had spent a lifetime crafting stories about loyalty, human connection, and resilience. He had guided young filmmakers, nurtured talent, and championed creativity. His work carried lessons of empathy and understanding, of standing by people even when circumstances seemed hopeless. And yet, in the final act of his life, the very principles he espoused had not shielded his family from destruction. Observers were forced to reconcile admiration for his achievements with the stark reality of his personal loss. Michelle Reiner's quiet strength was similarly underscored in retrospect. Throughout their life together, she had been the stabilizing presence, the calm within a storm, carrying burdens invisible to the outside world. Her ability to maintain composure, manage subtle crises, and provide emotional continuity had been fundamental to the family's function. In the aftermath, her absence emphasized how essential her steadiness had been, and how irreplaceable a presence like hers could be when confronted with circumstances beyond any individual's control. The psychological and societal dimensions of the tragedy unfolded in tandem. Experts highlighted the cumulative effect of prolonged stress, subtle behavioral shifts, and unaddressed warning signs. The narrative became a cautionary illustration of how love, patience, and protective intentions, when applied without clear boundaries, can inadvertently enable destructive outcomes. Families everywhere recognized parallels in their own experiences, moments when silence replaced intervention, when hope delayed action, and when care became complicit in allowing harm to flourish. The Reiner story became more than a news event. It became a reflection of universal human vulnerabilities. At the same time, the legal and procedural aftermath reinforced the profound complexity of the situation. Nick Reiner's measured behavior, both before and after the incident, challenged conventional assumptions about intent, psychological capacity, and responsibility. Every choice he made, every action observed on surveillance or in public spaces, became evidence not only of the events themselves, but of the nuanced interplay between consciousness, emotion, and consequence. The legal framework sought to impose structure on what was fundamentally a deeply human and emotionally intricate situation. The process of adjudication was, in many ways, a parallel story of assessing accountability while grappling with the moral and relational dimensions that lay beyond the reach of law alone. Within this context, the broader lessons of the Reiner story began to crystallize. The narrative illustrated the delicate balance required in family dynamics, the need for love tempered by boundaries, for protection paired with accountability, for patience combined with timely intervention. It underscored the idea that devotion, no matter how profound, cannot substitute for awareness, nor can empathy replace structure. The tragedy forced those observing it to confront uncomfortable questions about the limits of care, the dangers of silence, and the responsibilities that accompany trust. Despite the overwhelming sorrow, there remained a thread of enduring legacy. Rob Reiner's body of work continues to teach, to inspire, and to provide guidance. His films and creative endeavors retain the lessons he lived by, offering audiences insight into human connection, resilience, and empathy. Michelle Reiner's life, while quieter in its public expression, serves as a testament to the strength of silent dedication, to the power of constancy in the face of mounting pressures. Together, their lives and the circumstances of their passing highlight the duality of human existence: achievement and vulnerability, love and loss, intention and consequence. As the story settled into collective memory, it retained a haunting quality precisely because it did not offer closure in the conventional sense. There were no tidy resolutions, no definitive moral conclusions. Instead, there was reflection, awareness, and the persistence of questions about the nature of care, the boundaries of responsibility, and the vulnerability inherent in human relationships. The Reiner tragedy became both a personal and universal narrative, challenging assumptions and urging introspection. It left observers with a lingering sense of fragility, a recognition that even the most careful, loving, and devoted among us are not immune to forces beyond their control. Ultimately, the story invites contemplation of what it means to love, to hope, and to act responsibly. It asks how far devotion can go before it inadvertently shields harm, and how awareness, courage, and intervention are themselves acts of love. Rob and Michelle Reiner should be remembered not solely for the circumstances of their deaths, but for the lives they lived, the principles they embodied, and the compassion they extended to those around them. Their legacy is complex, imbued with both inspiration and warning, a testament to the profound, sometimes perilous, dimensions of human connection.